So this is the second part to our iteration control structures video. In the previous video, we talked about the for loop and some of the basic format and logic behind it. And today we're going to be talking about the while loop and the do while loop. So the while loop is basically the same as a for loop, except that the way you initialize the loop is a little bit different. It's a little bit less specific in the syntax, but here's how it follows. And before I start, I just want to say that the for loop and the while loop can get the same things done. It's kind of a matter of which you prefer. They're both loops that are available for you to use in Java. That both of them take practice in understanding both the syntax and the logic before you can start applying them easily to your programs. So again, I have this what will this output slide where you can either pause the video and take a look at the loop and see what it does and then guess the output for yourself, or you can just wait till I explain the syntax and the code, and then I'll just drag this little gray box off. So what we're doing first is we're setting a grade, and we're setting it equal to 1, and like the for loop, we have to set this because we have to have some sort of int that we're working with, or string, or whatever. And this is where we see our termination statement, which is inside the while loop. So basically it says this: our while identifier, and then our termination statement. Grade is less than 100, and then we have our opening and closing braces, and then our statements in between. So what this says is grade times equals 2, and again, times equals 2 just basically means grade is equal to grade times 2. So what it's going to be doing is it's going to be multiplying by 2 every time, and then it's going to be printing that, and then it's going to go up to the while loop and check if it's less than 100, and if it is less than 100, then the loop keeps going. And we have sort of this really like succinct loop where it checks if it's less than 100, then it does this, multiplies by 2, our increment, and then it does this, and then it goes back up and checks. And if you look at the syntax of the while loop, we have everything that the for loop does. It's just kind of structured a little bit differently. In the for loop, we have our initialization, our termination condition, and our update statement, all within that for body. But here we have it kind of spread out throughout the loop, where we have our termination condition right here, our update statement right here, and our initialization is of this grade right here, which is actually outside the loop. And so the logic behind this loop basically says that we have this grade, and it's multiplying this int grade, which is equal to 1, and it's multiplying by 2 every time. So again, it's gonna print 2, because 1 times 2 is obviously 2, and then it's going to go up and check, and 2 is less than 100, and then it's going to print 4, and then it's going to go up, check, it's going to print 8, and then it's going to go up, check, and then so on. This will keep going: 8, 16, 32, 64, and then 64 is less than 100, so it's going to multiply by 2, and then that's going to be 128. So even though 128 is greater than 100, the update statement, or the increment operator, is before the print statement, so it is actually going to be 128. So if we go ahead and drag this off and see what this prints, we get 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and 128. And that's very simple. The next thing we're going to talk about is the do while loop. And the do while loop is very similar to the while loop, but again, the syntax is a little bit different. So we have our initialization, and this basically says int h is equal to 0. And this do the do while loop basically has a syntax that looks like this. You have your identifier do with your opening and closing braces, and then actually your termination condition happens after right here. So what's going to happen is h is equal to 0, and then it's going to say do, and it's going to do this thing, anything that's in the body, and then it's going to go to this while and it's going to check, and if h is less than 10, then it's going to go up and do this loop again. So again, you can see that the way that the logic of a loop works is very similar in both a for loop and a while loop and a do while loop. But let's just take a look at what this is doing. So we have our int h0, and we say h is plus equal to 1. Again, h plus equals 1 basically just means h is equal to h plus 1, but plus equals, I guess, is less typing. And this is gonna be 1, and then it's gonna print 1. And then it's gonna go here and check that 1 is less than 10, and then it's gonna do the loop again. So 2, then prints 2, checks, and then goes back. 3, prints 3, and so on and so on. And then it's gonna get to 9, it's gonna check if it's gonna print 9, it's gonna check if 9 is less than 10, it is, it's gonna increment 10, it's gonna print 10, and then it's gonna check that 10 is not less than 10, so the while loop terminates. And then it's just going to print out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And that's basically what it is. And now what we're going to do is take a look at our IDE and look at some practice problems. So again, I have some practice problems that are super important and beneficial for learning while loops and do while loops. Again, I advise you to pause the video, that way you can learn the best. If your solutions are the same, if your logic is the same, that's awesome. It doesn't necessarily, our code doesn't necessarily have to be identical, but if you can figure out a way to print or figure out the solution with your own method, that's fine. But again, it's the purpose is to understand while loops and do while loops, so you definitely want to use while loops. I really strongly advise you to pause the video and wait till I and solve the problem on your own, and then skip forward to when I start explaining things for you to really get a lot out of this. So this says use a while loop to print every fourth number from 0 to 64. And again, you want to do the same thing with a while loop and a do while loop, just to understand how the syntax works. So we have our while loop, and this is our format, and then we have to, again, initialize our termination condition. So we're going to say, actually, we forgot our initialization, so we can say int I, because I love I, is equal to 0. And we should say while I is less than 65. Because we want to print every number from 0 to 64, so we want the while loop to terminate when I is 65. And again, what we could also do is say while I is less than or equal to 64. It really doesn't matter, it's the same thing. Whichever you prefer, I guess, whatever you're typing in the moment. And it says to print every fourth number from 0 to 64. So what we're going to do really quickly is we're going to set our print statement right here. And you really want to get a knack for understanding when to print and when to increment, because the order is very important. But we're going to put our print statement first, and we're going to say print line I, and then we're just going to I plus equals 4. And that's basically how you solve it. So what it's going to do is I is going to be equal to 0, it's going to print I, and then it's going to add 4 to I, so then it's going to go and check if 4 is less than 65, and then it's going to print 4, and then do the same thing, increment to 8, and then 12, and then 16, and then 20, and so on until it reaches 64, and then it prints, and then increments to 68, and then it'll check, and it's not. So we're just going to go ahead and run this, and you can see that it prints 0, 4, 8, 12, 16, all the way up to 64. And our while loop is correct. And now we're going to do the same thing with a do while loop. And again, this is the syntax behind a do while loop, and we can just say this time while I is less than or equal to 64. So what we're going to do is we're going to again set another initialization. So int s is equal to 0, and then system.out.println s, and then s plus equals 4. And again, the logic is exactly the same. It's going to print 0, and then it's going to increment, and then it's going to check that 4 is less than 64, then it goes back into the loop, prints 4, and then increments. So the logic is exactly the same. And you can take a look at that, you can study it, whichever way you can learn. And if we go ahead and run this, it should print exactly the same thing. Yep, it printed exactly the same thing. So, whoops, I accidentally set our counter wrong, so s is less than 64, so this way it should run. And you see here that it does. So then we're just going to really quickly delete this do while loop so we have some space. You can take a picture of it, you can study it, whatever way you can learn. And what this says is write a loop that increments high to every string. Counter, I don't know why I said counter, but basically you want to write a loop that keeps adding high to a string. And I said choose termination statement, so that means you yourself can choose when to stop the loop. If you don't know how to stop the loop, because we're going to be working with strings, I strongly advise you to check my string video, and that's where we learn some methods that are important in manipulating strings. So what we're going to do is we're going to set a string, and we're going to call it str, or string for short, equal just our basic string with our quotes, and we're going to say while, and here's our termination statement, and it basically looks like this. Str, we're going to use the length method, is less than, say, 50. And then we're going to set another string, and we're going to call that add-on. And so string add-on is equal to hi. And that add-on string is what we're going to be adding on. And then we're going to say system.out.println. Actually, before we do our print statement, we're just going to say str plus equals add-on. And this statement is right here is what's going to be adding hi to the string every time it loops. So this basically says str is equal to str plus add-on, and so hi is going to continue to be added on to the string. And then we're just going to print that str string. And then if we go ahead and run this, I'm actually going to comment this while loop out before, just so we can see what this does. We're going to go ahead and run this. And we see here that it just prints out a bunch of highs in a nice little pyramid, because one is being added to it every time. So yeah, you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a better understanding of while loops and do while loops, and are able to use them more frequently. What we're going to be doing throughout this video series is using those for loops and while loops a lot more for different solutions with arrays. So don't forget these. Keep these in the back of your mind somewhere, because I promise you they're super important, and we'll be using them a lot more. Thank you.